Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Institute. My name is David Shanker. I'm the director of the program on Arab politics here. It's nice to see such a large crowd. Ambassador Faley, good to see you. We're here today for a policy forum titled "The Fight Against ISIL, Shiite Militias, and the Coalition Effort," to talk about the release the release of two new fascinating Institute studies. If anyone had any doubts, the video released earlier this week of the burning alive of the Jordanian captured pilot Muad Qasasba confirms the moral depravity of ISIL. But 6 months into the air coalition campaign against ISIL, which commenced with the beheading of American journalist James Foley, the results have been mixed at best. The airstrikes have driven ISIL out of Kobane in Syria. However, overall, today, the group controls actually more territory in Syria and Iraq than it did 6 months ago when the war started. Air power alone is going to be insufficient to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL. To roll back ISIL, the organization is going to have to be countered on the ground. And we're witnessing right now the initial stages of this new phase in the campaign. In Syria, the administration's strategy of training up the moderate vetted Syrian opposition remains a distant, if realistic, option. Meanwhile, though, in Syria, Iran and the Assad regime are deploying a series of Shiite militias to combat ISIL. And across the border in Iraq, Baghdad, in cooperation with Washington, is working to reconstitute and field an integrated internal security force. To discuss these differing approaches to ISIL today, we have a great panel featuring Michael Knights, Phillip Smyth, and P.J. Dermer. Michael Knights is a Lafer Fellow at the Washington Institute and the author of the just-released study, The Long Haul, Rebooting U.S. Security Cooperation in Iraq. Phillip Smyth is a researcher at the University of Maryland and the author of the blog Hezbollah Cavalcade, which focuses on Shiite Islamist militarism in the region. The Institute released today, I believe, his study, The Shiite Jihad in Syria and Its Regional Effects. And commenting on their presentations, we're really lucky to have P.J. Dermer. He's a retired Army colonel who served multiple tours in the region, including 2 in Iraq. He participated in standing up both civil and defense institutions in Iraq and served as a senior military advisor for reconciliation to Iraqi forces in Baghdad in 2008. Before we start, just a quick reminder, please put your mobile phones on vibrate. We are live on C-SPAN today, apparently. So we'll start with Mike Knights.
Well, thank you very much for coming today. It's great to see such a full room, and my colleagues on the panel with me. It's a real honour to be alongside them. So I'm going to talk today about some of the themes coming out of our new study, the long haul, rebooting U.S. security cooperation with Iraq. I won't go through the study in detail. What I'm going to do maybe is to try and pick out some of the, I think the key issues and quandaries that come out of our security cooperation with the Iraqi state, with the Kurdish Peshmerga, and our coexistence at the moment alongside the Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization units that have played such a significant role in the war so far in Iraq. Now, just to run through a couple of graphics quickly, which are in the study, which is available in PDF form online for you all to download. We include, for instance, a full brigade order of battle for the Iraqi army and Ministry of Interior and the Popular Mobilization Forces, graphically represented, and it demonstrates, for one thing, how much of the Iraqi combat power is pulled around Baghdad and the immediate environs, how few of the Iraqi military units are able to deploy over long distances, the distances required, for instance, to commence a Mosul operation in the second quarter of this year. It's going to be very difficult to do that. And also the lack of combat effective Iraqi army brigades with the strength required to undertake a very complex, costly operation in Mosul. It indicates that the 9 Brigade US-led train and equip program to build oversized combat capable, deployable units that can continue to operate after taking the casualties required in urban combat. That 9 brigade train and equip program is vital. To me, it indicates that we're not looking at a battle for Mosul commencing until Q3, Q4 2015, and some people are even more grumpy about it than that. Again on this slide, and you'll see the graphic in the study, Iraqi army in yellow, Ministry of Interior in black, and the popular mobilisation units in red. If you're interested in looking at the detail, go look at the study. Likewise, we've done the same for the Peshmerga in terms of a slightly rougher, but actually probably the most detailed order of battle you're going to see out there on what the Peshmerga really looks like right now and how it is structured. Now, on this slide, we see, and even from the back, it should be fairly visible. The blue is Kurdish regional security forces, and the green is the areas where the federal government is contesting. One of the interesting factors in this is that you can see a little thin green line running from the Iranian border up through Tuzkamatu to Kirkuk. That's the Iranian line of supply. That directly supports the popular mobilisation units who are gathering and building for a major operation just south of Kirkuk at Bashir. I'm not going to talk about the progress of the war against ISIL. We'll do that in other forums, on other days, and through our written products. What I will say is to reiterate, I believe the war against ISIL in Iraq initially is highly winnable. And in fact, slowly, we're on that trajectory now. For many people, the velocity will not be fast enough, but the vector, the direction, is in that direction towards cutting them down to the stage that they are a serious insurgent and terrorist movement. Unfortunately, today's best case scenario were 2013's worst case scenario. The goalposts have shifted dramatically over the last few years. So, what we're hoping is that in the next year or so, we can cut ISIS down until it is our worst nightmare from 2013. And then we start again, and we start working our way to cut them down to where they were in 2009, when the security operations were at their most effective, probably, and then finally to get them down below that, to the hopes that we had in 2009. What I'm going to talk about today more is what if we defeat ISIS but lose Iraq in the process? What if there is another, possibly graver threat out there, which is the threat posed to some extent by the allies that we're working alongside? I'm thinking here about some of the popular mobilisation unit elements who are strongly Iranian-linked, Kataib Hezbollah, Sable Haq, all the movements that Philip's going to talk about in great detail after me. What if we defeat ISIS, but in the process we lose Iraq to Hezbollahization of the Iraqi security sector? It may sound a little dramatic, but there's a lot going on in Iraq that points in that direction. Is this America's Yalta moment in Iraq? Some people, they look at the Yalta conference in early 45 and they say, well, the US government was just being realistic. The Soviets were going to dominate Eastern Europe. Nothing could stop that. Others would say, would have an emotional reaction. This is when we were consigned to 50 years of communism, left behind the Iron Curtain. Even though I don't think it's a perfect analogy, where I think this is a bit of a Yalta moment is that we're in the midst of a war. The war's not over yet, but it's time to start asking tough Churchillian questions about how the war ends, why we're fighting this war to the end, who our allies are, and how they'll act after, let's say, Mosul is liberated, how they'll act towards us, how they'll act towards other elements in Iraq. I think, in the old days, Afghanistan was the good war and Iraq was the bad war, 2009 onwards. Since 2014, Iraq seems to be the good war and Syria is the bad war. But in reality, Iraq is going to be a lot more complex. I don't think Iraq is... I believe it's a war worth fighting involving the US. But it's not a complex or a simple war. Any sense of us being, in any sense, allied with Iran in this war against ISIS in Iraq is fraught with danger and far more complex than many people would believe. Now, one thing I've noticed since I started this study and researching, talking to a lot of people just to complete the data collection on it, throwing ideas out there about this Pyrrhic victory we could win if we defeat ISIL, but in the process hand Iraq over to a Hezbollahized Iraqi security structure, is that a lot of, first of all, it struck me that I don't think I've ever heard Kurds and Shia Arabs vent so much hatred at each other. Our allies in Iraq at the moment, ISIS's enemies, are remarkably divided, remarkably resentful of each other. It's sad to see because the fighting hasn't even vaguely stopped yet against ISIS. A lot of young Shia guys usually will say to me, what have you got against the Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilisation units? They're fighting ISIS, you're fighting ISIS, they're fighting and dying. Are they really so bad? And don't you hold them to a double standard? If the Peshmerga did the same thing, would you criticise them as fiercely? You want to build up the Sunni Sahwa again, the awakening movements. Didn't they do all of these things in the past? Didn't they kill Americans too? We do need to think hard about these questions. We do have something of an emotional reaction against some of the Hashd al-Shabi popular mobilisation units going for. So let's look at that. Let's just dig into that for a second. You know, are these bad guys? I don't think so. They're brave fighters going to the front line. Many of them are not psychos. Many of them are not trying to undertake sectarian massacres. They're just normal people. I had a similar feeling when meeting Hezbollah infantrymen down in southern Lebanon in '99, sitting with them and their families in their houses. But behind them, often far behind them, there was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force guys that I never did meet. And they had a very different attitude, and I certainly became personally aware of the difference between being in their midst and not their target, as I was in southern Lebanon, to later when I was operating in Iraq being actively targeted. There's something under the surface of these predominantly Shia popular mobilisation units that we need to look at very closely. You know, again, just to underline the point, on the left-hand side in the top we have the Sahwa guys. They look pretty scary, right? They're supposed to be our allies going forward. And in the top right we have these crisply pressed Shia popular mobilisation units backed by the Iranians. Who looks scarier? Well, I would argue, for a number of reasons I'll come to in a second, that actually the guys on the left, yeah, we need to treat both with care. But the guys on the right are not as cuddly or safe or trustworthy as they look. And the guys on the left, in some ways, because they are cut off, I think, from major state support, because they are not intricately networked into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, because they pull in smaller increments, because they are divided rather than having the potential to form into one large Hezbollah-like shadow defence institution that could threaten and overwhelm ultimately things like Iraqi Ministry of Defence and Ministry of Interior. I believe the guys on the right are a bigger threat. Likewise, look at the bottom. There you have a Western private security detail vehicle taken out by extraordinarily accurate and effective explosively formed projectiles fired by the Shia groups. On the right, but you know, there you have a Marine Corps LVTP ripped to pieces by a Sunni IED way back. Both have killed us. Both probably would kill us again, given if they needed to, if they felt like they wanted to. Personally, I'm more afraid of the capabilities of the IRGC Quds Force-based special groups. As late as June 2011, if you remember, they killed 16 Americans because it seemed like perhaps we were going to rethink our withdrawal from Iraq. I think they're much more dangerous than the Sunni-led groups. But I'll go on to talk about why very quickly. Two main reasons. One, an increased involvement of the Iranian-backed popular mobilisation units, particularly in areas to the north like Mosul, Tikrit, places out in the west in Anbar where they're at the moment being welcomed in piecemeal, but I think they'll wear out their welcome pretty soon. I think the involvement or over-reliance on these units will lengthen the war against ISIS. These guys are, if you look at this, I've blanked out the gruesome images of dead body suspended from a light, a lamppost in Bakuba in Diyala, left there by the PMUs. Likewise, a mosque massacre, bottom left, and this is not even images from the most recent massacre of '72, alleged massacre. Top right, heavy artillery bombardment of Sunni villages. They may be mostly depopulated with ISIS in them, but nonetheless, these guys come heavy when they come. And interestingly, the bottom right-hand image, you may say, there's a bunch of young fighters holding up an Iraqi flag. What could be wrong with that? Well, in and of itself, nothing wrong with that. But what they're doing is they're holding it up on the main road south of Kirkuk and taunting Kurdish drivers with it. This isn't smart, and it's not helpful. And it's an indicator as even when these guys are not out abusing civilians and undertaking counterproductive military operations, or at least have military operations with counterproductive elements, they're also a source of constant friction in many of the places they're operating alongside the KRG. Likewise, the second main point, these Iranian-backed militias, if not put under some form of control, will ultimately undermine the strategic independence of Iraq and potentially state stability. I think, we see some of the images here. Behind that eagle in the top left-hand side sits deliberately concealed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, a US designated terrorist since, I think, 2009, who's been pursued for various terrorist offences right the way back to 1983, involving Kuwait. Up there at the front lines, taking Iraqi senior leadership on a tour of PMU successes, but carefully hidden in this picture because it was recognised it might cause offence, perhaps. Likewise, former PM Maliki, Vice President Maliki now, meeting up with senior leadership in Hezbollah. Likewise, on the bottom sides, a US MRAP, and even though I think it's a bit of a stunt, US M1 Abrams with Kataib Hezbollah flags attached to it. I wish our information operations was as good as these guys. Everything we do, when we achieve something, what do? We like to fall into the background, and it's better that Iraqis could take credit for the things that they've achieved. Well, you know what? 100% wrong. When the IRGC Quds Force guys have any involvement, or even if they have no involvement in a successful operation, they get their most senior leadership right there and they plaster their faces all across every media outlet and social media outlet that they can find. I think we need to be doing more to demonstrate what the US and the international coalition is doing to stabilise Iraq, because we're really on our back foot when it comes to information operations. These guys are ambitious. They are not some kind of minor, small group of concerned local citizens, former Sahwa, etc. In 2009, when the Sahwa was being set up, these guys never disbanded. These guys never did biometrics. Most of these Sahwa movements, they came in, they signed their little piece of paper, they did the biometrics, which the Iraqi government now holds on them. Asable Haq, Kataib Hezbollah, and they never did that stuff. They just said, we might stop fighting you, but one day we'll fight you again. But for now, we're willing to take the paycheck for being, in quote, a son of Iraq. These guys are not from the minority like the Sunni Sahwa are. And these guys have got a serious state sponsor. These guys are in charge of mechanised unit capability now. These guys have got multiple rocket launch systems and a regular resupply of ammunition coming from Iran. These guys have got IRGC Quds Force compartmented intelligence facilities, SCIFs, within their headquarters that are linking them to IRGC Quds Force drone operations overhead, Iranian air support potentially, or Iraqi air support that's being facilitated by the Iranians in some ways. They are a powerful entity. They're well armed, they're networked into Ministry of Interior and some of the other key Iraqi security headquarters. They're transnational, they're linked to other aspects of the axis of resistance, Lebanese Hezbollah, IRGC Quds Force. So this is not, these are people who will undermine Iraq's strategic independence going forward. Luckily, bringing us round to the solution at the end, I think a lot of the moderate Shia leadership in Iraq are recognise that, whether they're in the political sphere, whether they're military men, or whether they're in the religious sphere. Iraqi military does not like militia. It never did. It didn't like Saddam Fedayeen. It doesn't like, I think, having to operate alongside the PMUs, even though it recognises that they have contributed blood, sweat and tears to stopping ISIL's advance. I have to give them that, absolutely. They deserve our respect as fighting men to some extent. And many of them deserve our full respect as fighting men because they have given everything, including their lives, to bring ISIS to a halt. But the institution that they're part of and the forces that sit behind these often very good fighting men, we need to look extremely closely at them. Now, luckily, I think a lot of senior Iraqi leaders agree with the US that they are a threat. And luckily, we have seen in many cases in the past the Iraqi Shia vote for Iraq rather than vote for sectarianism and vote for Iran. For instance, Iran-Iraq war, not really a shimmer of an uprising against the Iraqi state during the Iran-Iraq war. Hundreds of thousands of Shia serving in the front lines. Likewise, Basra separatism. Basra could break away and become Abu Dhabi if it wanted to. But instead, by and large, Basrawis believe in the Iraqi state, even though they've had a pretty shocking deal from it, particularly over the last decade. PM Maliki, doing Charge of the Knights, he recognised, even though I think he did it partly for his own political benefit, that he needed to cut the legs out from underneath the militias before they took Iraq's crown jewel, Basra. The National Guard law that's just being pushed through now. The Iraqis understand, senior leaders understand they need to do something about the PMUs and the Sahwa one day. They need to confine them to barracks. They need to partially demobilise them. They need governors in individual provinces to say we don't need PM, we don't need a National Guard division, brigade for this particular province. We're secure. A way of reducing the threat of militia takeover in some key provinces like Basra. It's under Ministry of Defence administrative control. It's under Prime Minister's Office operational control. All these things are built into the National Guard law, and they need to be. The struggle will be implementation because these Badr guys and these Iranian-backed militias will try as hard as they can to take this thing, take all the bits they like. We want to get paid, we want to have pensions, we want to have light armoured vehicles maintained by the government, we want to have light arms provided by the government, but actually we think we'll keep our rocket launchers and our ties to IRGC Quds Force. That's how they'll try and play it, that's how they always do. But we need to stay on this. And this brings us back to the final point. Oh, by the way, some of these individuals, Dawa Party are trying to keep a hand in Ministry of Interior, even though it's run by a Badr-level leader. So they have these guys, Akil Khazali and I think it's Samir Haddad, in senior deputy positions within MOI. Likewise, bottom left-hand side, you see Fallah Fayyad running the Hashd al-Shabi portfolio, I guess you could say, the National Security Advisor. Again, some conservative elements of Dawa Party, conservative as in they don't want a radical change in the nature of power in Iraq. They don't want to be one day jettisoned as those are the politicians that we, Iraqi Hezbollah, keep in the cupboard and bring them out whenever we want to look acceptable. They don't want that to be the end point for where Iraq goes. So we've got allies we can work with in Iraq. But the only way we're going to get those allies is if we outperform Iran as a security partner. We can't ask for everything we want from the Iraqis unless we demonstrate that we are seriously committed about going forward. And not just until ISIS is gone, not just until Mosul is liberated, but finally until, with no end point. We're talking here, what we need is a visionary, decade-spanning re-engagement with the Iraqi government for a deep, lasting security cooperation relationship. And why wouldn't we? This is not Lebanon, no disrespect to Lebanon, but if we lose Iraq to Hezbollahization of the security structure, this is a country with the same oil as Saudi Arabia, 35, 40 million and going up. connected to every key regional state. This is like losing China in the 50s. This is not some small country, even though I think some people within the administration have put it in a small box in their mind. That's not what it is. So we need to do more than the minimum and then leave. We need to demonstrate that we're there for the long term, and we need to say that openly. Because as I've explained, and Philip's going to go into in more detail, the Iranians are seriously playing. They're doing what we used to do. They're there with the Joint Terminal Attack Controllers on the ground, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Air Force, close air controllers, pilots who know how the Su-25s above that Iran gave back to Iraq work. They're doing this really well. We need to do it really well. And one of the things we need to start doing is to put more of our special forces closer to the front line, because if we don't demonstrate commitment to the Iraqi army, they will continue to rely on Iranian-backed PMUs as their primary offensive weapon system, and they can't retake back Mosul that way. The Moslawis will not accept it eventually. It will cause more problems, and even the PMUs probably don't have the force to take back Mosul. So if we want to finish off ISIL in Iraq, or even get head in that direction, we need a major Iraqi army build-up, we need to demonstrate US commitment, and we need ultimately to outperform the Iranians as a security partner. Now I'll just finish off by leaving something up. Just as I wanted to, we've got a in their shoes 5K run walk going on Comeron Run Regional Park in Alexandria, Virginia, May 9th, 2015. If you're interested, there's the URL at the bottom: www.sicfiraq.org. It's a good cause, so support it if you can.
What's really going on in Syria right now? We had a jihad that it seemed like nobody even noticed was going on. Everybody picked up on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, a section of Al-Qaeda fighting there, and this was described as the jihad going on inside of Syria. But people neglected the fact, people were neglecting this. This is another jihad, a major jihad, that just seemed to float under everybody's noses. Well, maybe it looked more organized, or maybe it was just organic, and there were Shia coming to defend this shrine in the back, Sayyida Zainab, which is south of Damascus. That was all it was to many people. That, okay, well, a few Shia fighters went to Syria, and they just wanted to defend the shrine. But it's not. It hides something that's much, much larger. We're now also seeing it in Iraq. We're seeing an ideological spread that Iran is trying to push their absolute wilayat al-faqih ideology among Iraqis, among other moderate Shia, and I don't like to use this term moderate Shia, but Shia who do not believe in their radical Khomeinist concepts. This is kind of what was happening in Syria in a nutshell, and now we're seeing it on this kind of regional plane, and it's shocking. I mean, it's shocking that not as many people were noticing it. So there are a few myths and facts about this Shia jihad. And I think, unfortunately, in the press, because it's hard to cover the issue, a few things have popped up. And I collected quotes from people that I know who were asking me about it as I was doing research. And one of them said, but don't all foreign fighters come in Sunni? And I included the chart here from the Washington Post, which cites ISIS fighters and other Sunni fighters, and it just lists them as foreign fighters. One of the largest, if not the largest, foreign fighter contingent inside of Syria had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. Had everything to do with the Iranians routing people from Iraq, from Lebanon, Afghan refugees who were living in Iran, sometimes from Afghanistan. They even routed in African fighters. They claimed to route in Somalis. They claimed to route in one man who was killed from Cote d'Ivoire. So this was a really large-scale operation. We're talking about tens of thousands of people. Another prime narrative in the media. It always goes, ISIS uses Facebook and Twitter. I mean, they have social media. That must mean they're more advanced. I have a little hint for you guys. The Shia militia groups that are run by the Iranians actually have a far more advanced recruitment structure online. Nobody has done anything to really take it off or even investigate it. It's all, I could go here. If we had Facebook up, I could find you one in about 5 seconds. They're doing this quite openly and not hiding it. They're putting up extremely graphic images, ones that many of us have written a hashtag about on Twitter about ISIS. much the same kind of material. There's another issue here. I talked about Iran's control of these organizations and the routing of these fighters. So one of the lines that was given to me by a friend, she's probably not going to be my friend anymore, was that, Phil, all these groups look pretty independent. Well, it's the devil's really in the details, and it's about a granular look. Don't miss the forest for its trees, but focus on the important stuff. A lot of these groups that were fighting in Syria openly stated that they believe in absolute wilayat al-faqih, and they just kind of passed below the radar. They were fighting alongside Lebanese Hezbollah, a devoted proxy to the Iranians. So there was a lot of interconnection here. They were training in Iran. They were then being shipped back after they were dying through Iran, not directly back to Iraq. So they're not that independent. They are directly controlled. Another line has been, they're not as brutal, and we are fighting the same enemy. Well, this makes a lot of sense, kind of, if you get past the whole narrative structure. These groups actually cast a narrative structure that said that all Syrian rebels were takfiriyin. They were Muslims who wanted to accuse other Muslims of apostasy, and thus they could be killed. This is how they cast even our U.S.'s so-called moderate allies. This was a larger narrative process that they underwent. And now it's coming to full fold when we're watching Iraq. And not that I'm saying that it's not ISIS doing a lot of the fighting, but they have cast kind of this Sunni enemy of theirs as takfiris. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are your buddies. So the other thing is that they were just reactionary. Well, these groups were around for quite some time, decades even. I'll give you the example of the Badr organization in Iraq. The Iranians created them or helped create them from Iraqi refugees who went over to Iran in the early 1980s to fight Saddam Hussein. They're even part of Iraq's government. They even dominate the interior ministry. So these groups have been around for a while. Lebanese Hezbollah, they've also been around since the early 80s, but that doesn't mean that they are not growing at rates that we've never seen before. Because there's a new crisis, we have new organizations. The other main thing is Iran's reach in this is totally overstated. I can't say how much annoyance that actually causes me because they're so open about this, about how they control these organizations. Again, all you need to do sometimes is go on Facebook, or all you need to do is follow Iranian media. And here's the weird thing, and Dr. Knight's actually brought this up. Even if they're not directly controlling a group, they'll claim to do it. And then beyond that, they'll then try to influence them with, cash and weapons and support. And then guess what happens? They become another little micro Hezbollah. I would actually say in this, you can never ignore this top-down strategy just because these people are recruiting from a wide stream of Shia. I'm not saying everybody's a Khomeinist. Not everybody who's fighting in a Shia militia believes in absolute wilayat al-faqih. But there is a top-down, trickle-down kind of structure here. How many of you in here a few decades ago would have said, Lebanon's going to be a great place for this absolute wilayat al-faqih because we all know how religiously aware and radicalized the Shia population is there. I'm pretty sure not many. And now look at it. So these are kind of main issues, and hopefully I've cut through some of that. So we now have the narrative of jihad. Why were people going to fight in Syria? How did this lead to the current events in Iraq? How did this lead to Shia militias fighting against ISIS? First and foremost, a religious crisis needed to be manufactured. And when I say that, there was the supposed threat against Sayyida Zainab, which is this major mosque and shrine, which is in southern Damascus. A lot of interesting, weird, granular connections to Iran with this shrine. They actually rebuilt it. That's why it has a nice, pretty golden dome. So what they cast this was to get fighters to go into Syria. They needed people who would go for a religious reason, a justified reason. So the justified reason was that they were doing their shrine defense. But it wasn't just that. Just saying shrine defense, doesn't fit in with the Khomeinist narrative that was being pushed. Why would they need to defend it? Oh, well, they're defending against those takfiris I mentioned earlier. But who pushed the takfiris to this? Well, America, the state of Israel. It was the West. So that was wrapped in within this. There was a whole conspiracy wrapped in within this. And if you're really looking at the long term, real big long-term problems with this kind of outlook, it now casts this vision that maybe the United States really did want to push for the shrine to be destroyed. Maybe the U.S. was really pushing these moderate rebel groups because they wanted them to be al-Qaeda. Qasem Soleimani himself actually said this. He came out and he said, America has been trying to push al-Qaeda into Syria. I mean, for most of us sitting here, that would sound kind of ludicrous. But that's been the narrative. So there's that. Beyond all of this, by doing this move, they're actually executing a really grand regional strategy that doesn't just target Shia. And it actually targets a lot of minorities. And I think we saw a lot of this. Sorry, do you mind if I grab the soda here? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, guys, I'm running dry. I get excited. So, all right. So in addition to this, we have to deal with the minority issue. If you remember back when Hezbollah first had to deal with Syria pulling out of Lebanon, what did they do? They had outreach to Tayar Watani al-Hur, which was Michel Aoun's party. And by doing so, they attained this wonderful Maronite Catholic ally. And they could put this veneer over them and say, hey, we're Lebanese nationalists. Don't you see? Yeah, the Khomeini stuff, it's on the side. But don't worry. We're for this Lebanon thing. Beyond that, when they're trying to push the whole concept of wilayat al-faqih, it doesn't make sense to a lot of us. This is an Islamist ideology. In Iran, Christians are not really treated all that well. But then they're also playing into these fears of drowning in the Sunni Sea. And they've been doing this quite a bit with Christians. And if you've noticed, Bashar al-Assad will also push this messaging up. Christians, if you don't align with us Alawis, if you don't align with the Shia, these Sunnis are going to come in and brutalize you. They're going to destroy you. So there's been that other move that's been pushing them in that direction, kind of pushing a minority alliance of sorts. They also push the good Sunnis versus bad Sunnis line, as I like to call it, where Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah actually would come out and he said this. He goes, we're not against Sunnis. I mean, he would simultaneously make a sectarian message, a pro-Shia message, but say, we're not against Sunnis. Actually, the Takfiriyin, these are not Sunnis. These aren't even Muslims. I mean, he was actually declaring them as apostates, all of his enemies as apostates. So there was that other categorization that was going on simultaneously with all of this. But the biggest thing that's going on are these pan-Shia themes. And the pan-Shia themes, they are trying to cast this narrative that Iran is the protector for the Shia in the region. Yes, they are still casting the Khomeinist message that says we are pan-Islamic, that Ayatollah Khamenei, he is the Wali al-Faqih for all Muslims, not just Shia. But they're starting with the Shia first. And if you think about it in a geostrategic sense, if you're trying to form clamps around main enemies, namely the Saudis, the Gulf, and also the Israelis, it makes a lot of sense when you also have forces in those areas. So those have been a big thing. But then there's this. They have tried to minimize their link to this, while also trying to say that we have maintained this jihad. And it's kind of strange. They don't want to show that there are geopolitical interests that are at stake. If they lost Syria, they would potentially lose their most valuable ally in the Arab world, which is Lebanese Hezbollah. You have to have Syria. You have to have that bridge. And if they lost it, that would be no good. So, of course, it would be a great idea to drive up a jihad. No? But if they said that, oh, we're driving this as, us Persian Iranians, we're having a jihad just to defend that sole interest, not many people would buy into it. And it all traces back to that shrine over there. I attached a photo in here, and this is from one of my favorite, it's not really a nasheed, but it's a song that's been played by Asaya Bahl al-Haq, which is a direct Iranian proxy. And it actually says, kind of rough translation, we're not here fighting for Bashar, we're fighting here for the Shia. That's been the message. And that's how they've tried to cast it. Now, if we're looking at Iraq and we're looking at how a lot of these fighters have filtered back there and have been sent back there, what are we seeing now? Well, we're protecting Islam. We're protecting, and to them, Islam is Shiism. That's how they're doing it. So when we have to look at this, we have to focus on the actual militias. Which militias were really going and sending people to Syria? There's a lot of confusion about what the Sadrists were doing. Muqtada al-Sadr, I'm sure we remember him as the firebrand cleric, this terrible guy. He bombed Americans, he killed Americans when we were in Iraq. But there's kind of a gray area when it comes to this. And the gray area is kind of the weird thing, because there's a lot of odd info ops going on online to try and say that Sadr is fully alongside the Shia jihad in Syria. But there's also evidence to say that maybe Sadr did donate a few people to fight in Syria. We just don't know. But for the most part, there were a lot of people who were what we would call Sadrist splinters. So back during the Iraq War, when we were there, a problem happened with the Sadrists where he was trying to maintain the Mahdi army, Jaysh al-Mahdi. And this didn't work out so well. He pushed back against the Iranians. Not a great idea. And so what did they do? They encouraged these splits, and they tried to build separate little organizations. And the really interesting thing, as I was doing this research, I tried to look up people who helped form this group. I call it Lafa Network, but the actual name is Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas. This network, the initial core of commanders, almost all of them were Sadrist splinter people. One of them who was killed, they would call him Kayara. He was killed, I'm going to say, December 2012. This is a person who actually served with Mr. Dulaimi. Mr. Dulaimi was a Sunni who converted to Shiism, who eventually was in an Asai Bahl al-Haq network inside of Iraq, and he also raided the provincial headquarters for the American forces when it was in Karbala, killing five of our guys. So he was in some way related to that. So the old expression, it stinks on ice, to say that they're Sadrists, it kind of does in this respect because, yeah, they may have been Sadrists. They may have been promoting a lot of Sadrist imagery and some other things. But they had clear, direct links to the Iranians. So going down more, we have the old standard bearers. When I say old standard bearers, I mean the good old Iranian proxies that we know so well. Mainly Lebanese Hezbollah. They were some of the initial forces that were sent by the Iranians into Syria. They were serving as advisors. They were also serving as direct combat advisors. But also they were helping form up localized militias made up of Shia and also Alawis. The Badr organization is another one, but it's a little bit more complex when you look at the Badr organization. Because what did Badr do? Badr also, simultaneously, while building their own process and putting their own fighters into Syria, were also building new separate special groups inside of Iraq, taking some of their members, putting them in there, and then saying, okay, now that this new group is formed, we're going to send these people to Syria. For instance, one of the newer groups that I put past Asai Bahl al-Haq was Katab Sayyid al-Shuhada. One of their first martyrs was actually the son of a prime Badr militia or Badr Corps commander who was killed many years ago, celebrated by the Badr organization. And his son was somehow killed fighting for Katab Sayyid al-Shuhada, which believes in the exact same ideological concepts, which just kind of came out of nowhere in early 2013. And this is kind of the connection that they have. I guess going past that, we also have Katab Hezbollah and Asai Bahl al-Haq. I'm sure, again, a lot of people remember these groups. They EFP'd American soldiers. They killed a lot of coalition forces. And also, some of these guys were the first into Iraq. And actually, the interesting thing, what they would do is they would go to Iran and then take a Syrian air flight into Damascus, unload. They'd be wearing, their civvies, and they get off the plane and everything was fine. They'd pick up a rifle and then they go and fight. And they were not even hiding this earlier when they were coming into that country. They were not hiding the flights. They were actually openly advertising it on very easily accessible Facebook pages, which is kind of shocking. Makes you really think about this. I mean, was that an OPSEC fail on their part, or was it something else? Were they trying to promote that, hey, we can go into Syria whenever we want. Who's going to stop us? The biggest issue here has been the Syrian-based groups. These are local actors, or at least they cast themselves as local actors. Initially, the Syrian Mukhabarat, their intelligence groupings, tried to help form up a lot of localized Shia militias. The main one that came out of this, as I stated before, was Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas. But from Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas, it just kind of expanded out. Think of it like an octopus with a million different little groups that were associated with it. Could we write some of these groups off as maybe subdivisions of the larger LAFA network, like they're just a battalion underneath a larger army group? I would say yes. I mean, I think they're all networked together, but they have now taken on their own separate names, their own separate identities in some cases. They've taken on their own separate recruitment activities, both in Iraq and in Syria. They don't really hide this. They have their own commanders, a lot of them coming out of that initial network. So this is kind of the nexus that has formed. So Iran's Proxy Web, and I actually put Akram Kabi over here and Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah holding hands. Akram Kabi is a guy who helped found Asai Bahl al-Haq. Asayib al-Haq, as I went through before, one of these first special groups that we saw in Iraq. But what's Akram Kabi doing now? Thank you. What's Akram Kabi doing now? He's now leading a group called Harakat Hizb Allah al-Nujabba, another group like this. So you can see, kind of through these trails, it looks crazy. There's a million different little links here, there, and everywhere. Why would they do this? I mean, a lot of people have asked me, they go, how does this make any sense for a grand regional strategy? And I'll get to this. Now check this out. But wait, there's more. When we're looking at this, and I have tried to track down all of the different connections, and you just wouldn't believe this. I put up Qasim al-Tai, who's a radical cleric, where some of his fighters and people who have claimed that they are with him have gone. We have Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas over here. I'm sorry if I'm making the C-SPAN guys angry. I keep leaning back. But all these different groups. I even put in black and white over here, that symbol over there. That's called Liwa Fatimiyun. Liwa Fatimiyun was formed by the Iranians to rout Afghan fighters, Afghan Hazara fighters. They put this in this big corps, and then what did they do? The minute they got to Syria, they were not fighting under the banner of Liwa Fatimiyun. They were fighting under Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas. They'd put the patches on. They'd serve under their commander, Abu Ajib. Sometimes they had their own sub-regiments. But all of this confusing jumble, I had to put a line through solder because, how else am I going to represent solder as splinters? But I mean, you had all of this. And when you get to this, there's another odd thing that happened. After they had already splintered 4,000 different ways, what did we end up having? They did it again. It's just crazy. They did it again. So Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas, in August, the actual group that's run by Abu Ajib, formed a group that's called Liwa Sukar al-Imam al-Mahdi, or Sukar al-Imam al-Mahdi. So it's the force of the hawks of Imam al-Mahdi. So this is their Iraq-based contingent that's fighting there. But a bunch of other groups have also taken on the Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas name. Tons of them, actually. And a lot of them even have connections back to the original Liwa Abu Fadl al-Abbas. Is this a deliberate move? Possible. If it's not, I really don't know. I mean, they really need to get their stuff together. But there are a bunch of these different groups that have done this. I mean, even Liwa Asad Allah al-Ghalib, which was a group that was formed in December of 2013, at least that's when they announced. I think they were formed a little bit earlier than that. They even started their own Iraqi contingent. So all of this is going on, the spread and the movement and the networking, it continues. And if we're getting down to brass tacks on this one, when we look at it, I think a lot of this is just kind of a little game that a lot of people in IRGC-QF like to play. Because a lot of these people will share members, they'll fight in the same fronts, they'll say they lost the same member. It's all a big game so that I can sit here, suck down my Diet Mountain Dew, and just slam my head against the table as I'm looking for yet another militia group. Now, in addition to this, I wanted to focus on my favorite, this is my white whale of militia commanders, Allah Hilal. I had followed this guy since he had his first Facebook page. I kid you not, and he actually ran it himself. And he also had this great haircut. He'd wear this awesome turban. I mean, it's like everything about him was this own personality. But when you're looking at it, what does his presence really represent? This is a major thing, and I actually mentioned him in my report. Initially, he came out, and it was announced via Harakat Hizb Allah al-Nujabba, this new group, through their organization, that he was a commander in Aleppo. The Aleppo area. I mean, imagine this. That's nowhere near Site of Zainab in Damascus that they're supposed to be defending. Then they promoted him as a solderist. That's actually a picture of him that was put up after he was killed. I'll get to that. After he was killed, with Muqtada al-Sadr in the front, and you'll see him in an orange shirt in the back. He came back to Iraq in the spring of 2014, didn't hide this at all. But then he was named as a commander of Katab Malik al-Ashtar. The greatest thing about this is after he was named, he actually had 2 music videos dedicated to him, and he appeared in one. Not making this one up. But afterwards, another shift seemed to happen. Nobody mentioned Katab Malik al-Ashtar anymore. Where'd it go? Did it just vanish? Did it disappear into thin air? I didn't see any mentions in Iraqi press. I didn't see anything on their TV media, which I leave on most of the time. But then they showed him with Katab Hezbollah and Katab al-Imam Ali. By showing this, Katab al-Imam Ali was a new organization that was formed in Iraq by Shab al-Zaidi. But he's the Secretary General, but Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, as Dr. Knights mentioned before, is kind of the real push behind that. So this would necessitate that he had much deeper connections to IRGC-QF than we probably realized. And then, interestingly enough, after being pictured with them, he was never named as one of their guys. When he was killed, he had an official martyrdom poster, an official funeral, and everything for Kitab al-Imam Ali. And all of a sudden, his name and face spread all over the kind of Shia militia web. So he was marketed as this big-time martyr. A huge thing that I realized when I was doing a lot of this research was the recruitment factor online, something that I really and truly believe that nobody is paying all that much attention to. They have been posting phone numbers and all sorts of things. This is actually one of the initial ones that was posted. This was taken in Najaf, where they would put up a popular committee number. They'd hide it in the imagery that you're looking at and put this all in there. And I think a little bit more needs to be done because guess what? I've called into these numbers. There's somebody sitting in the audience who has called in with me to these numbers. And we've had conversations with these guys. So it's really not that hard. Now, what did they accomplish? Oh, by the way, I love this picture of Qasem Soleimani because it fits in with that narrative that, we're pushing ISIS. What have they done? They've secured Damascus. They have secured the rule for Bashar al-Assad. Hands down. This was not the Republican Guard. This was not some magical local Syrian, Syrian militia that did it. No, this was Hezbollah. This was the other allied organizations. And I don't even describe these as links. They are all part of a unified network, and that's how they're developing this. So while we've done this, they've taken a ton of geography in Syria. They've been able to construct a new Golan front. If you think about the pincer moves, as I was talking about before, they're assisting in doing that. Their infiltration in the Iraqi government and now also within Syria I would say in Syria it's almost complete. It's not like Assad can really push back against them. He's the main, they're the main fighting force. And then on top of that, for the Iranians, building this narrative of strength, projection, and then protection for Shia groups in the Middle East, this is huge. When you feel you're under an existential threat, I think any Shia, if I were a Shia and an Iranian IRGC guy came in and said, I'm going to give you money. I'm going to give you guns. The Americans, they're dawdling right now. They're not doing enough for you, and they never will. They are Shaitan al-Akbar. They're the great Satan. I'm pretty sure I would take it if I thought that ISIS was going to destroy me. And they're playing off of that so effectively. So, bigger thing, probably the biggest thing, and I put all this in here. There are other regional consequences to the growth of this group from this Shia jihad in Syria. I've heard this question. Will they magically moderate after ISIS is defeated? I don't believe so. I don't think so at all. It's kind of like saying, did Lebanese Hezbollah moderate? Did they drop their weapons after the Israelis pulled out of southern Lebanon in 2000? They most certainly did not. They kept their arms. Actually, the same thing happened when we pulled out in 2011. Asayib al-Haq to join the Iraqi government said, hey, we're going to drop our arms. Never did. But here's the biggest thing. My buddy, Allah Hilal over there. Does anybody know what poster this belongs to? This group this poster belongs to? That's Sarai al-Mukhtar. Sarai al-Mukhtar is a new, smaller, young guys who came out of the February 14th youth movement in Bahrain have put this up for him. It kind of says something. Now, there's a Kitab Sayyid al-Shuhada poster over here. It says, Labaik ya Zainab. It has the phone numbers on it. And if you notice that red blotch behind the fist, what's that a map of? It's a map of Bahrain. Why would they put that if you're pushing this jihad for Syria or for Iraq? Then we have a poster of Nimr al-Nimr, who was jailed by the Saudis for speaking out against their government. This has become kind of this new cause, this cause célèbre for them. Oh, if the Saudis execute him, Kataib Hezbollah came out and said this. If they execute him, we will retaliate against the Saudis. We will strike them. So now they have a new cause to fight. And it will keep going like that. This is a regional struggle. When I talk about Shia jihad in Syria, it's not just Syria. It's Iraq. It's the Gulf. It's going to encompass a lot more. Ignoring it will not make it go away. Allying with it will certainly not make it go away, because I actually would say that they have manipulated this process right down to a T. They've done a very good job at it. And I don't really see it going away anytime soon, which is sad.
I'm going to take a breath here after that Phillip's briefing, trying to digest all that. My name is P.J. Dermer, retired military officer. Started in the infantry and went aviation in both conventional and special forces. And then my last years were blessed with multiple tours in the Middle East. So I'm going to take a little bit of a slower approach, bring it up a little bit higher, and hopefully I'll get through this without a lot of tears, because these movements out there are emotional to myself and a lot of us that served on the ground, trying to figure out what to do with the information like Phil would put out in briefings we would go to, and trying to figure out how to put all this together in a practical sense and give a couple of policy recommendations. I think I'd start off by saying Dave asked me to kind of just give a small synopsis about the papers. I'm in pretty good concurrence with Mike. I think what both Mike and Phillip have outlined today is how complicated, even more so, the region's never not been complicated, but how complicated things are now. We tend to work within borders of nation states. We tend to work in fundamentals of regional actors. We tend to work in fundamentals of the of the theory that action-reaction, rational actor theory, meaning I punch you, you punch me back, or I punch you, you get mad, you storm out. Anything out of those two spheres, you're like, what are you doing? Why are you not punching me back? How come you're not walking out? We get lost in sometimes in our own theses, while trying to do a good thing. And I think what both the authors have pointed out is, particularly Phil in his driving down in the Shia line and block charts, is it's quite complicated. And how do you maneuver in that thing? I will put out to the crowd today that it's not new, though. What Phil has pointed out is not new. We've seen these kind of demarcations and lineations and things in the Lebanese Civil War. We've seen it in Syria before. I was in Syria in 1982. I was in Hama in February of 1982. And the Syrians asked me when I came out of Hama what was I doing there. I was backpacking through. Of course, they never believed me, but never mind. But you get to see these delineations and these split groups. There's a lot of personality involved in this. There's a lot of personal quest for power. There's a lot of personal interest. At the end of the day, as in-depth as this briefing was, who knows why actors do what they do? 2008, when I was in the negotiation cell that was set up by General Petraeus, a very small group. Mike Prejean was with me, sitting in the audience back there. He just wrote the great article with Michael Weiss saying how the Iranians are the best thing ISIS could have. The targeteers and the human analysts and guys of the same intellectual brilliance of Phil here, and I mean that, would come in and lay out these big charts about lines, and this guy talks to this guy, and he phone called him 3 times, and they talk, and they sneak away in the weekends and this and that. And as the person who was responsible for actually going face-to-face with folks we were trying to get to, both in the Sunni and the Shia side, a lot of them in prison, a lot of them not. We would fly around the Middle East. We would look at the chart and go, wow, a lot of names, a lot of numbers, a lot of da-da-da. Okay, so who can I talk to, number one? Number two is, when I'm with them, what do I say? I mean, am I meeting them for the heck of it? Nice to see you in Buka for lunch. Flew in a long way to Cropper. I mean, glad to see you in Bahrain today. What is it you'd like to do? I mean, there's an essence behind all this that sooner or later you have to bring down to the practical level. And I think the point that was raised today is how much more complicated the ground is than I think, in fairness to what both Mike and Phil are saying, and I would agree, than I think we're fundamentally understanding. Or, if we understand it, let's say we do, our actions are not belying the fact that we do, i.e., we are currently embarked on I would train and equip in order to defeat ISIS campaign, I would say. That's the focus of where Washington is and the great Americans that have been redeployed to Iraq, no one can imagine, to build up forces to defeat ISIS. Well, great. I think what the officers have pointed out, and I would agree, is, first off, how did it get this bad? I mean, when I saw that ISIS had taken over Mosul in June, besides throwing my phone out the window and my computer across the room, as a practical operator that had fought these guys so hard, I saw the YouTubes and the newscasts of the Shia marching and forming and marching in units from Qadmiya and Baghdad all the way down to Basra. And what you see is, first off, they're all in uniforms, to include Hadi al-Amri comes out of the closet, and guys like him. They're in uniform. They have modern weapons, all of them, not a couple of them like it used to be. 2 guys in the squad would have weapons and the rest would have wooden rifles. They all had weapons. And to include some of the more sophisticated stuff like the explosive form projectiles. I don't know if you've seen those, but they're conical, 12 to 14 inches, very, very heavy because it's copper, and which would kill most of our our mates in the fighting that blows through the armored vehicles, impenetrable. They'll penetrate anything. I mean, they're carrying these in formation. And they're in formation, and they're marching, and even the clerics are dressed up. So that didn't happen between the time ISIS took Mosul and the time the news guys got there, meaning it had been going on for a very long time, to include while we're there, not just since we were deployed. So that's the basis, and now we get to the ISIS part and the schisms that are now developing. As Phil laid out, it's gone from a ISIS takeover to a perhaps religious conundrum throughout the Middle East. Again, unfortunately not new in history, but in our time, new enough. And how do you act? That's the tough question. It's nice to get the briefings. It's nice to see the charts, but somewhere in this world of issue, where do you plug into the first plausible thing to do? Well, right now we're going to go get ISIS in Mosul, or get ISIS. Okay, but the rest of the general crowd out there, as Michael has so adeptly pointed out, it's a tactical thing for them. ISIS is not a strategic issue. And I think we need to rise to that level and look at the strategic fault movements out there. I'm a believer in approaching it from fault lines and fundamentals. In other words, there are certain fundamental issues and beliefs in any sphere, and the Middle East as well, that exist. One of them, I think, is still true. How do we place another? One of them is very much the Arab-Iranian divide, the Shia-Sunni divide, the Persian-Arab history gulf. I mean, that is not a small fundamental. And my proof in this is when we got to Iraq, and my first trick was building the city council, and then I went all over Iraq with just Iraqis for 9 to 10 months, building the new MOD and the Army. So I was the main recruiter. So all these bad characters, yeah, my bad. All the ones that are left alive don't know where they are, and most of them are dead or gone. Okay. But to a T, now you have the meeting room, and then you have the sidebars where they pull you aside one-on-one. To a T, the common thread was no Iranian influence, no malign party influence, political party, no party hacks. And we want technical guys, we want scientific guys, meaning proper training for the task ahead. Okay, it's military, but same thing. So to a T, I mean, we didn't find a lot of schisms here. The only guys that gave us a hard time were some of the clerics, but they weren't on top of the world like they are now. Moreover, it crossed boundaries. In 2008, after fighting in Basra and Baghdad, I was a senior military advisor in Baghdad, an Iraqi division commander came to us and said, "This is really a great day." And I said, "Yeah, Sadr has retired from the battlefield." Now, Sadr did retire from the battlefield, namely because Maliki took the gloves off of us, and the Iraqis came forward with us, and we did a lot of fighting in that time, particularly in the Sadr city, New Baghdad, or areas. But special groups, as Philip pointed out, special groups did not play in that fight. Special groups were being guided and sensed and strategized from a different place. And I think that's key to understand between the nationalist point I'll get to in a second. So what he said in his speech, he says, "Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, great Americans, great Iraqi patriots, today is the first day in the battle against Iran." Okay, now this division commander was Shia. He was not Sunni, he was Shia. The Sunni would say that anyway, but he said that. This commander, oh, by the way, just defected, is now in the States seeking asylum. He was given command in the South, I won't say where, just a few months ago. And one evening he got a call from Maliki. And Maliki said, "I have some visitors coming to your unit. I want you to put them to work. I want you to embed them in your staff, and they'll help you achieve achieve stardom." And the division commander, the commander, not division, he was above division, said, "Who are you sending to my staff?" They knocked on the door, and they were from Asab al-Haq. And the commander said, "You were Prime Minister Maliki?" And they said, "Yes, you have orders from the Prime Minister. Where would you like us to go?" And the great patriot Shia Iraqi said, "Not here. I don't have a place for you." And they said, "Well, that's great. We love it, your opinion, but you don't get to decide." This commander got on the phone with Maliki, and this is a story relayed by him, and I've had it corroborated once. I don't have complete 100% faith in it, but I've talked to this. I put him in power in 2003. Got on the phone to Maliki, and for 45 minutes was arguing back and forth, saying, "Look, I can put them in the Riverine Patrol. I can have them do food duty, but there cannot be in my general staff headquarters, and that cannot be on the streets with my soldiers. Malik says, thanks for your loyal opinion, take him or else. 2 days later, I got a call, and he was in Istanbul. And I got very mad at him because I said, what are you doing in Istanbul so fast? You crazy? Because he left his family and everything. That's how intensely he took it, and the rest he's trying to work out right now. So he's Shia, and he didn't think that was the way to go. So I think these fundamentals don't fail, i.e. Iraqi nationalism. The question is, okay, if so, how do we work in that veld? How do we operate in that environment? I will tell you, operating in the religious environment, which is that this fights in Iraq and in Syria and in the Gulf and Yemen are all happening under the guise of a religious now breakup, which is bigger than what we started with, we're going to have a tough time because we work in fundamental ways here on Earth. And in negotiating with bad guys, we never had a problem getting one-on-one with a bad guy, getting a dialogue on with a killer. Never had a problem getting along with a killer. Orange jumpsuit, not orange jumpsuit. Sooner or later, you could find a ground where you could work out something. Even with Sadr Group, I had some neat things happen. But the minute we were approached with the opening line, Bismillah, Rahim, okay. If we went more into religious dialogue after that, to include saying that we are prepared to die for our God today, we had two ways to respond. We're prepared to help you, okay? Okay, we are, very much so. To include when we walk out of this building, or I can't go there. I'm not at that level. With all due respect, we're going to have to bow out of this part of the negotiation because I don't speak for my God, and the guy next to me's God is different than mine. This could get rather complicated. Now, if you're willing to come down a level or whatever level you want to call it, come up a level. I'm not going to speak for you. Let us begin. But at the point of dealing at that level, I don't know where you go. We had a chaplain in one of the units in Baghdad who's a great guy, 6'6", was really into the reconciliation councils. He would have the whiteboard when the meetings and all this. I offered that he should take lead of this. You and your gang should be leading, not us peons on earth. This is not our bailiwick. It never came to fore. So number one, the complications are vast. Two, understand the fundamentals. Three, and I agree with Michael here, very much so, get in the big game. The game of ISIS is bad news. Those guys, gals, whatever they're made up of, are really projecting themselves in a way that we all agree is pretty macabre. Again, not new, unfortunately. But that's not the game. We're not in that game. The United States military, if unleashed and allowed to play in the sandboxes and knows how, can do a lot of damage. But you got to also understand that is not just a formation of guys in black with weapons. ISIS is not, I would argue, not a formidable, it's formidable, but it's not this very structured thing that if we push it out of Mosul or push it out of X spot up in Kurdistan, it's going to go somewhere and then it'll be there for our beckoning with our air power. No. Understand what it is. Phillip has done a very good job of helping explain that. But pushing ISIS out of Mosul, it's not a bumper sticker. So we have to be in the greater game, and I think the greater game is outlined by Dave and by Mike is, of course, the Iranian influence. And some people are asking me, I don't know what that means. What do you mean the Iranians? Well, they get first cut. That's what it means. They're the first ones in the morning, last one out at night. They get 6 hours a day. We get 45 minutes with the body in between whatever. No. Qasem Soleimani can have 45 minutes. We'll take the 6 hours. And you know what? A body, you can put your office inside the embassy if we so decide. But we're not in that game. And I've seen this time and time again. I've done the deployments to Libya with the DOD team before Chris was killed, other places in the Middle East where we show up, hi, you're here, what do you want to do? And we're meeting, and it's really, when are you going to play? Are you guys going to play? Why do you keep getting on the plane to leave? The Brits are here, the French are here, the Qataris are here. Where are you guys? We'll hold that thought. We'll be back in a few months in the next meeting, okay? And you have to really be in the game. I also would argue that this is not a conflict to be far away from. If you really want to play in this game, we have to adjust the balance between the force protection concepts that we've fallen under and the ability to meet face to face. You have to ask the question. I already asked the question, where do the Shia militia get all this armament and uniforms from under our noses? Well, what happened in some 2011, or pick a date to before ISIS, I don't care, in terms of the diplomatic means? All right, the guys that are living out there day in and day night, guys and gals, and supposed to be interlocuting with their partners. Where was that influence? And can we get it back? If Qasem Soleimani gets 6 hours a day, we have an uphill fight to get the influence that we should have be back. But it's really interesting because there's a conundrum out there. There's a contradiction. You won't meet anybody, armed or not armed, Shia Sunni, that doesn't look at you as an American and representative, either uniform or civilian, and won't tell you to do something. And what they'll tell you is be the power. You're the power. Be the power. Stop playing around. If you're not the power, then evidently you don't have a real big problem about what's going on out here. For reasons we don't understand, but it's your business. So whenever you're ready to quit playing possum, come on out. But in the meantime, I got to talk to Qasem Soleimani and Hizbah, because they're here. Okay? And in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, guess where it lies? So, understand the fundamentals, be in the game, understand the complexities. And last, I would just add, I would agree that with Mike and also with Phil, that concentrating on the fringes, which it looks like now we get the views of the air campaign, the number of sorties, the number of Kurdish movements, even Kobane, as deadly as that was, is not where it lies. This fight, this struggle, lies in the capitals. Okay, it lies in the capitals of power. Our pressure, our priority, as much as enjoying freedom of the skies in Iraq right now, and I don't know what we'll do in Syria, lies in Baghdad and Damascus, and Riyadh. All right, and I've never been out in a place at a level that never always wanted to go higher. The first question is, who are you and who you represent? There's no way when we were negotiating as negotiators for General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker, the 2 or 3, 4 of us that were out, that's the first thing we had to establish is, are you speaking for your grand self, Mr. Colonel, or have you been formally sent here in a position of X? Because that's really where it lies. The playground that Phillip has so rightly outlined, these guys are being manipulated from A to B. As he noted, one day they're Sabal this, and next day they're Hizbah that. All right? Their reasons for doing things are really, at the end of the day, I argue, not that complicated. Okay? Maslow, whatever. But up top, where the real game is where we need to be. And the 1 or 2 people that I would never happy to go in with in a closed room, and always on my game, if I had a game, was the guys that were doing the thinking, the guys that were doing the information operations, the guys that were the mouthpieces, the guys that were the whispers in the ear of Sadr and of Ghazali and of X. Because these were the good-looking guys. They had the nicest clothing, and they were very intellectually astute, very well studied in whatever world they came from. Not my world, but their world, never mind. And they could spin you if you weren't careful, or turn this or turn that. I'd want to join by the time I left the room if I wasn't careful. It wasn't going to happen, but sometimes I feel like, maybe, I don't know. The point is that intellect is out there, as manipulative as it can be, as Phil's pointed out, and you have to be able to know how to deal. And first off, you got to take an hour worth of lecture against the great Satan. Got it. Yeah, I know. We are the worst. We are the worst. But I know one worse than us over there in Khomeini land. Huh? At least we leave good intentions, a school, a hospital, whatever. At least we intend to. What they're going to leave, I don't know. But you will do what they tell you, and no matter what they tell you, for the rest of your life. So this is not easy, but these precepts have to be joined in to do. So I think to sum up, I would argue that Mike has done a great job, and Phil has done something that very few can pull together, and all with open source information, which is extremely important to understand, especially in today of the communicative world. I would be in Baghdad, inside the command center of Baghdad, watching or advising the senior. His name is General Aboud. Aboud is one of the villains of Mosul in this summer. Aboud and the ground forces commander. General Bood was a great guy. He was actually a nice man. He was a decent man. I mean, he really was. It was nice to find out. He just wasn't your classic wartime commander. He hated the fact that he had to fight Iraqis, which, oh, by the way, was another theme throughout the armed forces. Nobody in uniform in Iraq, unless they had malign intent, wanted to fight anyone in the population of Iraq. This is what happened in the turnaround in Fallujah in 2003, and this was the reticence of the Iraqi forces to fight in Basra in 2008 and in Baghdad. The forces really only moved forward when we came on the battlefield and went first, and we lost a lot of guys because of it. That's when they came forth. None of them wanted to tackle the civilian component, and this is another added dilemma that I would add to Mike's program. If ISIS is defeated, we coming back around for a whole nother kind of fight, because the Iraqi forces, no matter what they develop, if they're true Iraqis, if they are nationalists in theme, won't want to do it again. Thank you.
EJ, thank you very much. Michael, Phillip, these are great presentations. By the way, these studies can be found downloaded in PDF on Washington Institute website. That's www.washingtoninstitute.org. I know we're going to go about 10 minutes worth of questions, but let me just ask first. Mike, in terms of specifics, how many soldiers right now, ISF, are currently being trained up? What's the order of battle that Iraq is going to be able to bring against ISIS? When are they going to be able to bring it? And is it going to be an integrated force? That's for you. Phillip, Hezbollah, perhaps the largest of all the Shiite militias now operating in Syria. How does it coordinate with the other militias, and what are your estimates of their losses to date? And let's make that as really short answers, and then we'll get to the group.
I think the raw numbers of Iraqi security force and Peshmerga and Hashd al-Shabi, to be honest, all those figures are in the report. A snapshot view in early 2015 was of around 48,000 active combat strength for Iraqi army, a significantly higher number for MOI. But again, not nowhere near what they were back in its peak of the ISF capability in 2009, or even before ISIS in 2014, the big takeover. The main thing is this: how many active forces do they have that are capable of moving and undertaking offensive operations? That's the key metric that we're looking for. And if it's with the Iraqi army right now, it's a remarkably small number. It's probably elements of one armoured division and the special forces. It's well under 10,000 guys. And that means that currently the PMUs, the Hashd al-Shabi, they're probably able to throw more offensive mobile troops than the Iraqi army can right now, and possibly even the Iraqi army and the Ministry of Interior combined. The Peshmerga, I would say, probably have as much active mobile capability as the entire Iraqi army, Ministry of Interior, and maybe even Hashd al-Shabi put together in terms of people they can actually move to a battlefield.
Thank you. Phillip?
In terms of, sorry.
You're good.
Okay. In terms of Hezbollah serving as advisors and also working with the Syrian army, initially they came in as in that advisory kind of role, but now it's taken on far more of a command-style role. And it actually, if you juxtapose it to Iraq, with Asayab al-Haq coming into certain areas and taking leadership roles with some Iraqi units, and this didn't really please a lot of guys in the Iraqi army. It also didn't please some people in the Syrian army. There were actually a few little firefights that actually occurred between some of these Iraqi Shia militiamen who were with Hezbollah and also with some of the local militias. But they're essentially running the show now. They are running the show in terms of command structure and everything else. I mean, I'm not saying that there's no Syrian army left, but these guys now have the strategic know-how. In terms of numbers that are lost, officially Hezbollah says that it's in the high couple hundreds. I would say it probably goes much higher than that, probably into the 1,000 range, probably more, because they've hidden a number of their casualties, or they've hidden them as casualties from Syria. So it's very, very hard to get a true gauge of that.
Thank you. I'm going to call on some folks in the crowd and maybe identify yourself. Wait till a microphone comes. And up front, please. Barbara.
Hi, thanks, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. As Claude Rains would say, I'm shocked gambling is going on. When the U.S. overthrew Saddam, something like 50,000 members of the Badr Brigade came in, I'm told, and benefited as the U.S. advanced to Baghdad. They came in right behind. So, hello, Iran is next door, and had fought a war with Iraq and had groomed all of these people, and now it's reaping the benefits of the U.S. decision to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We'll leave that aside for now. The question is this. I'm hearing from some Iranians that Iraqi Shia don't really want to fight to take back the Sunni areas. What they want to do is control Baghdad south. Similarly in Syria, where we have a partition of the country in effect. How would all of you react to the notion that what we're watching is simply the partition of these two countries, and that the U.S. would like to keep them unified, particularly in the case of Iraq, but the people who live there actually don't really care, and Iran doesn't really care as long as it has its corridor to Lebanon, it's got its spheres of influence, particularly in Iraq, in the areas where most of the oil is. Thanks.
Mike, PJ, you want to take that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, any partition always sounds great, right, until you address the map. And then you go put all the layers on it of ethno-sectarian identity, geography, regional identity, etc. It ain't that easy in Iraq. If you look at where the Iraqi security forces have punched back to now, you can see them spreading up these seams of Shia Turkoman communities, for instance, that stretch all the way up into Kirkuk. There's still the pocket at Tal Afar behind, well behind ISIS lines still at this point. So, no partition of the country, and there's no limit to the PMUs. The PMUs will have to go very far north to liberate all Shia areas. So I don't think it's neat and tidy for sure. And like you say, if they're trying to maintain a line of supply out to Syria, well, that's running right through Anbar, Nineveh province, alien areas.
Right, and I'll pick up on the point. I think there's no reason to, if you have the Basra, which is the major income for the country. Essentially, number one, we like to say, those of us been out there doing business, that Basra doesn't need Baghdad, but Baghdad needs Basra. So you have the south, you have Basra, you have the port, you have the oil, and then you have Baghdad, you have the capital. Why push your luck? Why go get into food fights up there as Indian land for what? You're not losing anything. And I do also believe that once victory has happened, there's a very good scheme of evidence and that fights within themselves will occur. And I think Phillip's what he showed today supports that. If you studied Lebanon, if you studied other civil wars in the Middle East, which a lot supports that as well. We have to challenge the assumption, and if the Shia win or get to a certain point in the program where they bump into the Kurds and they're going to settle, and then the Sunni areas are left, well, the smartest thing they could do is just sit, because the dynamics of the history of that region will show that they'll turn on themselves sooner or later, one way or the other. All those lines that Phillip showed are going to have to go somewhere, and it starts internally first.
Thanks. Ambassador Faley?
Thank you very much. I have an observation and a question, if you don't mind. I mean, an observation, if I look at it from a strategically point of view, I think amidst all that, ISIS was lost, which I think in itself is a tragedy, but I think we need to look at ISIS' role and the venom of ISIS in that it has no rule of engagement, its viciousness and others is creating on its own a culture of violence, which may mushroom into other as well. So I think that's the aspect of it. And in relation to all the Shia entities, you can have a similar Sunni entities, which is mushrooming out as well. So unfortunately, that's a bit dangerous. I think the key question here is, in the midst of that, who are your partners and who can you work with? That's I think where the government of Iraq has declared it as democratic, and others as well. They are the only sort of, at this moment, within all that, the safer option to work with. However, to do that, there has to be a clear commitment from the United States. I would say that one key issue is don't repeat the last 10 years' mistakes and learn from that. That's what I think any re-engagement has to seriously take that into account in having a better culture awareness and understanding the whole nuances. And that's on the micro level into addressing all these. At the macro level, or at a more holistic point of view, I think you are absolutely right when you say that the capitals have to have a dialogue. That dialogue it can't be just a Shia-Sunni problem, because it's not. It's much more than that. It can't be about dividing Iraq or not dividing it, because that creates its own mushroom scenarios, ripple effect, whether the U.S. has a role or not. Let's be frank, clear about that. But I think it has to be a serious dialogue. The nuclear issue is one element of that dialogue, by the way. A serious dialogue between the regional players. United States can significantly influence that dialogue and create some environment for a serious chat to take place. Otherwise, I think we are doomed.
Can I just take one part of this?
Thank you.
I agree. I mean, look. I agree on a number of things that you just said. But with all due respect, in terms of the growth of ISIS, this is a two-way street, particularly in Anbar. What would they do? They would go out and kill tribal leaders, kill awakening leaders, but who was also killing awakening leaders? A lot of these Shia militias were going out there and putting power drills through people's heads and dumping their bodies places. This actually aids to a radicalization process. And I think, I'll say this on a personal level because I focus on the Shia entities. I don't really think it's gotten all that much attention. I mean, there's a few New York Times articles on it, and that's about it. But this is far more circular than just the absolute and utter disgusting brutality that is ISIS. It's a far larger picture, and I think that if we addressed it holistically, as you said, we'd probably have much better results.
PJ, do you want to say something about the U.S. commitment that the ambassador is talking about?
Yeah, I thought he said it well enough. You said two things. Don't repeat the same mistakes of 10 years ago. Inshallah, I would agree, because I was part of those very mistakes. I second-guessed many things that I did personally, and we did. A lot of people that served in Iraq say we could have done more, and I like to argue, I'm glad we didn't in some ways, just being honest. But two, not only the U.S. commitment, but it's the U.S. leadership. Either we're leading this thing or we're not. You can't have it both ways as who we are, and that's what we hear every time we travel. There's an incredible befuddlement in the region at large as to not only will we not take charge, but the minute we leave the room and we hear somebody doing something, we call them up and go, don't do that. Why are you doing that? No, whoa, wait a minute. That didn't come out in the office call. Yeah, I know, but we don't want you to do that. I mean, it's an incredible conundrum that we act in, and I don't know how parties out there get it. And hey, exactly.
So, we have a number of additional questions here, but I don't want to go over it today. So if you have those, please come up. Until then, thank you very much for coming. I think this was a great panel, and I think everyone will benefit from looking at these publications. So thank you once again for coming. Thank you.